good evening, everyone. Thank you. I was just about to turn my phone to silent because it's so embarrassing after I remind all of you to do that when my phone rings, right? But this is a good moment to say, please silence your phone. And if you're going to take pictures, do not use a flash. That would be great. So, good evening, virtual audience. And hi, stranger.
No, it's been all of 2 weeks since I've been here.
I feel like we're your home bookstore. Is that true?
Yes,
It really
absolutely.
is.
That's fair.
Right. Don might even be back in December with who's coming? Let's see. Stuart Woods. So that's Britt Battles and Jack Stewart, who is writing W.E.B. Griffin, but then will be writing Tom Clancy Jr. And the last book from Andrews and Wilson, writing Tom Clancy Sr. So Don is our perpetual host for all of these things. But that's a good lead-in to say, first of all, we haven't seen Marc Cameron for quite a while. So, Marc?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You bet. And every attempt to do something from Alaska with Marc has crashed and burned, hasn't it?
Yeah, the dogs kept wrecking on the way down.
You know, the dogs ate the book plates. There's something about the Alaska, and it's just something in the air conditioning. I know it feels like the ceiling's coming down, but just ignore it. I mean, we tried 3 times to get one set of bookmarks here from Alaska for one of Marc's books. And as far as I can work out, whatever the USPS is doing in Alaska, it's not working. No. So we finally got him back here. And since at one point, both these gentlemen were writing Tom Clancy books, I thought we might start out and talk a little bit about that as kind of a warm-up. So, Marc, you were writing Tom Clancy Sr. for how long?
I did 7 books. So
Jack Ryan Sr., sorry.
Jack Ryan, yeah, Jack Ryan Sr. I did, so from 2016, I think the book came out in 2017, but 2016 until a couple of books ago, so 7. I didn't want to surpass Marc Graney. He did 7. I thought that would be a good number to stop at.
So it was Marc, and then the handover went to you.
Yes.
And then did it go to
Andrews and Wilson?
It went to Andrews and Wilson right away.
Yeah.
Okay. And now they are moving on to do something different of their own. And who is stepping up to do?
So Mike Woodward, MP Woodward, is moving from Jack Ryan Jr. to Jack Ryan Sr. So he's got his call up to the big show, right?
I don't know.
And Jack Stewart, who is writing W.B. Griffin, is going to take over Jack Ryan Jr. And you know, it's interesting because tell me what the remit writing Jack Ryan Sr. was about, and then I'll tell you why Mike Woodward said he'd agreed to write it.
Boy, so I was a Clancy fan from the time I was 1984 when the Hunt for Red October came out. I was in the police academy in Texas, the regional police academy, and got a hold of the book when it was in hardcover, one of the early hardcovers, and just devoured it. And you know, I can pretty much follow my career by knowing, okay, when the first World Trade Center bombing happened, I was sent back to New York to help guard that judge, Judge Mukasey. And I was reading a paperback copy of The Sum of All Fears. And then something else happened. I was reading this book and this book along the way. And so when Robin Rue, my agent, called me, my wife and I were in Florida doing research for the Arliss Cutter books. And out of the blue, I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea it was coming my way. But evidently Marc Graney had taken one of my manuscripts and given it to Tom. The most interesting thing, and I shared this with Don, and I think Tom Colgan, who's an incredibly great editor, by the way. I think Tom Colgan may have told Don the same thing, but I was terrified. I loved the characters so much. I loved the stories so much. I'd really grown up with them from the time I was about 21, and that it just seemed impossible. And so I shared that with Tom Colgan, and he said, "Don't worry about that. Don't try to write a Tom Clancy book. Write the best Marc Cameron book you can in the spirit of Tom Clancy." And boy, it just took a huge weight off my shoulders to be given that freedom. But it's still scary. And you know, I don't know how Don is, but when I write a book, there'll be several thousand people read it during the first week. When a Clancy book comes out, there'll be a gajillion people read it, and I swear They are sitting by their books. There's with a TI-80 graphing calculator and a Jane's Ships of the World, making sure that we have everything exactly right.
Change shifts of the world. I hadn't heard that for a
Yeah.
long time, but I see your point.
I think the other half of them sit on the Clancy Facebook page and wait for the book to drop just so they can say, Tom Clancy's dead, right? I'm like, yes, we're well aware of that.
Or some 10-year-old boy goes, my game stopped working. It's your fault.
So you moved from writing a couple books of your own, and you took up Jack Ryan Jr. So did you have any kind of blueprint, or did Tom Colgan give you the same speech?
I think so. He gave me the same speech as far as to make me comfortable. I think the writ, as you put it, for the books, or what's supposed to be different, is that Jack Ryan Jr. It's supposed to revolve more around him and be more of a localized, small stakes, and then the Tom Clancy Sr. is supposed to be the more broader, global. Unfortunately, those of us who are storytellers kind of decide what we're going to do anyway. And so by the end, Colgan's like, you're writing Tom Clancy series books. What are you doing? You're writing the... And I'm like, that's what I think the story is. And so I think he's been very cordial right now, but I think we should tell you when we fought. So here... and I was glad he was in Alaska at the time, because he's a bear of a man who used to track down people and bring them in. But one of the things that makes this series real unique is that we're writing with the same world, some of the same characters, and our books come out every 6 months. So I'm writing one as his is about to come out, and his book influences mine and vice versa. And so for my very first book, Target Acquired, I was kind of floundering a little bit and trying to come up with what the plot is. And so I called Marc and I said, hey, so I've got this idea, but it involves Jack Ryan. We would call them your characters because we kind of fenced them off. These were his, these were mine. And I said, it kind of involves your characters a little. I had this idea of if, something happens to Kathy Ryan and it got really, really quiet on that end of the phone. And he said, that is the exact book I'm writing right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, the zeitgeist. I was talking to a screenwriting partner of mine, and we were coming up with these ideas, and about 8 months ago, we came up with a really great idea, and then I see that somebody else just sold that show. When it's in the world, it's in the world. And so we read the news, we read The Economist, we read foreign policy, and we've got similar backgrounds. I never was an Apache pilot, so it's not as cool as Don. But we have some kind of adventure guy kind of backgrounds, but also reading some kind of 10,000-foot level stuff. And so we're going to come up with, especially because with the Clancy books, you kind of went Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran.
Yeah.
And when you're kind of rotating through these geopolitical spaces, it's hard to come up with, which is why I think 6 books is really the maximum. 7, I did 6 did 7 because I was able to go back and do a retro set back in '85, and so it kind of gave me a little steam release. But it's hard not to come up. It's hard to come up with a new, fresh plot, especially when your main character is sitting behind the Resolute desk all the time, and he's got to send out his minions.
So our first one, after that conversation, he got me back because I was 3/4 of the way through Target Acquired, my first book, and I had this love interest, this Israeli thing that Jack Ryan Jr. was gonna woo and all of the good stuff. And he texted me and he's like, by the way, I gave Jack Ryan Jr. a girlfriend that he brought home to mom and dad, and she's missing one arm. Have fun with that. And so I got to get him back because my second to last book, I was originally going to kill a character, and the estate didn't like that, and so I had to go back and rewrite the book. And so he was waiting to figure out who was hurt, and I was like, I don't know yet. I'm still rewriting. And he texted me, and he's like, can you tell me at least who is ambulatory? Because I need somebody who can walk. So that was kind of the fun nature of writing 2 books in the same universe at the same time.
And it was great fun. Don and I was really pleased to see him come aboard. I think, looking back, I think the book's really kind of folded in well. I remember one time Tom Colgan called me on the phone, and he said, "You literally have Jack Ryan Jr. sitting in the back seat of the van through this entire book." And I said, "Yeah, I'm leaving him to Dawn."
So it's been an interesting progression because Marc Rainey wrote some and then decided to stick with his own books, The Gray Man. You are now here with an Arliss Cutter book. Don has moved on to Vince Flynn, which is another universe, and Mitch Rapp. But my comment about Mike Woodward, he said to me that because he wrote a book called Red Tide, that is a wonderful book, that he found that the Jack Ryan Jr. were too personal, too small, and he was going to move on. But then when he was offered Jack Ryan Sr., and it could be a more global, bigger stakes, he decided to do that. So it's really interesting. I mean, I've sat here through the whole thing. So, and my only time with Tom Clancy, should I tell that story?
Yeah.
I should turn off the camera.
That's a good story. It's a good story.
Well, back in 1999, I think it was, there was a very classy event here at the Phoenician that was, do you remember what I said the name of it was? It was, anyway, the idea was that it was for rising college seniors, and it was to give them a really splendid opportunity before they went off to, and they brought in an astonishing array of people from all the arts. So we had 18 Nobel Prize winners. We had James Earl Jones. I thought my little girl taking the money, I looked over at one point. I was sitting over here, and I heard this kind of scream, and I looked down there, and I saw coins flying through the air, and I thought, what has happened here? And she was looking up, awestruck, because when he spoke, it was like Darth Vader, there we go. Let's see. Sue Grafton and I sat on the floor while she signed 400 copies of A is for Alibi to do the whole bit. But anyway, Tom Clancy was supposed to be one of the speakers at this astonishing thing, and his editor at Putnam nixed it because he hadn't finished his book. So I was disappointed, but Tom was on deadline, and, there we go. So as I'm walking into the Phoenician on Saturday, I see a familiar shape and face walking in front of me. He had snuck in. So since he didn't know me, I followed him to the elevator and got in because I thought this could be my only opportunity to ever spend any time with Tom Clancy, right? So I rode up to whatever floor it was, and it was all top secret. We were never supposed to tell anybody that he had snuck in there for the weekend. So book selling's really been an extremely interesting profession in terms of the side. Yeah. So I just had dinner in Florence at a villa with a former Prime Minister of Canada, the only woman, her name is Kim Campbell, who's married to somebody named Hershey, whom I never heard of. But anyway, the real point of the dinner, it was so exciting, was Helen Mirren.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to talk to Helen Mirren about doing the U.S. book launch for the Thursday Murder Club, which in fact incredible. I did do with Marc Billingham as a Zoom event because it was 2022. And, who knew? I mean, it was just fascinating. We took a couple of clandestine pictures, but we all agreed that it would not be in the spirit of the evening to post any photos of Helen Mirren at dinner, so we're not doing that. But I just can't resist. Then I thought, coming through Charles de Gaulle, coming home, that if I were you two, if I could get you there, we could blow up the airport, because that is the most horrendous airport I have. I mean, you need at least 3 hours to make a transfer, and they booked us for like an hour and 20 minutes, and I just found it astonishing. Anyway, let's get back to the point of the evening now that we've done all that. So you warmed up on Tom Clancy Jr. Jack Ryan Jr. How did it feel to step into the Vince Flynn universe?
Really, really intimidating, and to be fair, like Marc said, I was a Clancy fan too. He kind of invented this genre. And for me, it was more, I read him as a kid, and then as I was going through college and ROTC, the officers and stuff that I wanted to be like, they were all reading Clancy. And so it was, even though it was fiction, it was kind of almost that bridge of professional development. It's entertainment, but Clancy had so many things right that military officers would read it and love it too. And then when 9/11 came around, Vince Flynn was, I think, the first author to really capture the spirit of the nation at that time, like that thought of like, we've just been hit with this horrific thing. We want vengeance. And he crafted that with Mitch Rapp, that this protagonist that would unapologetically go hunt his nation's enemies down and give them justice in a way that nobody else could. And so I was serving in the military at the time. I remember reading a bunch of his paperbacks when I was in Afghanistan. And then, like most writers, Marc and I were talking about this before, you have trunk manuscripts as you're trying to figure it out. I wrote 3 books that didn't sell, and after my second one didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, because I was a fan long before I was a writer, which was Protect and Defend, and I note carded that all out, and I stuck it to our bedroom wall so my wife could wake up with Vince Flynn every day and kind of look at these crazy, beautiful mind note cards. But for me, he was number one, my favorite author, number 2, the writer I wanted to be someday. And then, you know, once he passed away, like everybody else, I thought this is going to be the end. And then Kyle stepped in and did such a great job. And so when I had the opportunity to do that, Kyle and I have talked about it before, that for him, because he and Vince came up together at the same time, that Vince was more of a peer. They were both writers who succeeded at the same time. For me, Vince was the guy I wanted to be someday. And so having the ability to write in his world was very, very heavy, because Kyle had done such a fantastic job, because the fan base, I think something that that Tom Colgan did well with the writers is because there were so many, the fans don't care that much anymore when one writer changes out, because I think they've grown to trust the publisher, where with Vince, there was only ever Vince and Kyle. And so now it's this new guy coming in to do it. And so I really, really wanted to do justice to Vince, but I knew I couldn't write like he did. Kyle, again, he is a fantastic writer, and he's super meticulous. And if you hear him talk about his first book, which was The Survivor, he calls it a forgery, and he says that not because he took the idea from Vince, because I think there were like 3 sentences of that book that Vince had written, but because he made an effort to study the way Vince wrote, his sentence construction, how he referred to things, and tried to alter his writing style to be Vince's for that book. And I knew I couldn't do that. And so what I tried to do instead was just go back to those books that Vince had written and read them over and over and over again, so that perhaps subconsciously I could make some of the same choices that Vince would when he was writing the book. And so that was kind of my approach to it. But much more so, like I said, Clancy came about. I'm a little bit younger than Marc, and so Clancy came about for me when, 84, I think I was 10 years old. Vince was when I was in my prime, when I was in the military in 2001, and so he felt not like a peer, certainly, but much more of my generation, even though he's 8 or so years older than me. And so it was much more personal. For me, the stakes were higher, even though everybody was fantastic about it. Emily Bessler, like Tom Colgan, was nothing but encouraging about it. But it was something that was certainly very weighty, for sure.
And luckily, Capture or Kill made it to the New York Times bestseller list. That would have been pretty crushing if you'd fallen off, wouldn't it?
Thanks, Barbara. I mean, next week this time, she
call
could
him
be
while he's
like,
writing the
you
book."
are the one that knocked Vince Flynn off the New York Times bestseller.
No, you're not going to do that. And actually, the reason I wanted to start talking about Clancy a little bit was, would you have felt as able to do the Vince Flynn books if you hadn't already stepped into somebody else's universe by writing the Clancy books?
No, I think absolutely not. I think it's funny from my perspective, I'd be interested to hear what Marc says. I think what writing for an estate teaches you is that when you write your own book, it's yours. It's your baby. You will go to the mat for it. You'll fight everybody for it. The editor will tell you what to do, and you'll say, no, by God, this is my book. But when you're writing for an estate, it's not your book. And not only is it not your book, but it belongs to the fans in a way that your own doesn't. And so you feel, at least I did, kind of a different sense of how do I do this in a way that's honoring, and if my idea or if the way that I write doesn't match what the series is, then the series needs to win out. And I had to figure that out for the Clancy books, and I think that helped for the Flynn. What would you say about that?
No, I agree, and you and I actually had this conversation early on. If you look back, I don't know if anybody out here has read a Legacy Clancy recently. They're different. They're written differently than we write today. I believe they're written differently than Clancy would write today. And so our job as Clancy Estate writers was not to mimic Clancy. It was to be true to his characters and make readers feel the same way that Tom Clancy made them feel.
That's
You know, this was back during the time when he wrote, well, all his books. It was pre-Wikipedia. And so he could take the time to spend a page and a half describing a K-bar knife. If I did that, Tom Colvin would go, okay, say K-bar knife. That's enough. Because the people that are reading it know that stuff. And so we had to, and future writers have to write with a different way, with a different mindset about than Tom Clancy did. But we have to stay true to his characters. But I agree with what Don said. They're not our books. They're not. So on my books, if I get a note back that I'm pretty adamant about, I really hold the line. They're my books. My name's going on them. With the Clancys, I maybe argue once and then, okay, you know what, that's yours.
Yeah, I did that a little more even with Denied Access with this book, is because the other thing I had to wrap my head around is what is true is not necessarily what that world is. And so what I mean is, like, one of the things I do in my books and the Clancy ones is I do the military radio communications, how it's actually done, right? And so, because to me, that's veracity. That's what, well, when Vince did it, he didn't do them that way. And so at first I was like, well, I need to correct these. And I'm like, well, it's not correcting them because he's built that world, and in his world, that's how they do it. And so I need to take my ego out of the way and say, this is how Vince did it. This is how his fans expect it to be. This is how it's right now in this world. And so I think, like, some of that, the Clancy one taught me, but it really is, I think, getting your own ego out of the way and saying the series and the book matters more than you as the writer.
Oh, absolutely. But another thing that I was talking to Don about this at lunchtime, another thing that Don brings to the table and that I in some way brought to the table with the Clancys that we really pushed on, some of the first editorial notes that I ever got from Tom Colgan, who's just a mensch of a guy. He's just a great guy, and he really is versed in the care and feeding of authors. He knows how to handle us and knows how to put a smiley face in the right part of your manuscript, or when you're just so brain locked and you know that you're 3 days late on your deadline and you're just brain locked. He's like, okay, let's calm down. You don't know this, but I've worked that, given you a padding, right? But he told me, he asked me, he said, why do you have the guys laughing in the middle of a gunfight? Why are they cutting up like that? And I said, because that's what you do.
Yeah.
And I think you push back some in the same way. So we push back some, but when it comes to the way you talk, so truth is not always, you can be a lot more true with fiction than you can with nonfiction.
Yeah.
So, Marc, let's talk about your book for a moment. Tell us about being a U.S. Marshal.
Well, a lot of times people will come up to me now because I've been so incredibly fortunate to have my two dream careers. So I've been retired from the Marshal Service for 13 years. In Alaska, I can't really use this comparison, but people down here, when people say, what does a marshal do? I say it's like a sheriff, except for the federal government. We're the muscle of the court, but we work for the Department of Justice. And Don was FBI and an Apache pilot and a whole bunch of cool stuff. But Don was FBI. I was a Marshal Service. So when I first started with the Marshal Service, we had a saying. I don't know if you guys remember, but Hertz Rental Car used to have this thing, we're number 2, so we try harder. That was the Marshal Service's our motto, because the Bureau was the I when I explain things to people, I point out, because there's some good natured and some bad natured, animosity between the two, and kind of infighting, mostly between the bureaucracies.
Yeah,
not
that's
the
true.
Deputies and
That's
agents,
true.
right? And mostly it comes from the marshals when we've had to sit in court with a prisoner all day, and they got to go out and do surveillance, right? So
Or McDonald's,
then
one of
we were
those
getting
two.
grouchy, right? But most of the time we get along pretty dang well, and I think that carries over into our writing. Well, I did a bunch of Westerns, and I did a bunch of Jericho Quinn books, which I'm working on the 9th of those right now, which are more geopolitical and all of that. But I had wanted to, I feel like there's a lot of geopolitical thrillers out there, a lot of military. My son at the time he's an Air Force Academy grad. He's speaks a couple of different languages, speaks Mandarin fluently, and he was an OSI counterintelligence agent for about 6 years. And so I thought, but I didn't know that. I knew it was OSI, but I didn't know he had such a cool job. And so I decided to write about an OSI agent. So many stories like that out there that I thought, I want to write about what I did. So when I retired, I started writing about a deputy marshal based in Alaska. And I was a man tracker for a while, and before I did the stupid thing and promoted. But, out in the woods, and did a lot of rural work. And so I made my character a deputy marshal based in Alaska. And that's been, so now I did the Clancys. I would do a Clancy, and then an Arliss Cutter, and a Clancy, and an Arliss Cutter. And now I've stepped away from the Clancys, and I do a Jericho Quinn and a Arliss Cutter. And it's been, like I started to say, I've been so fortunate to have my two dream careers. I retired from the Marshal Service in 2012 when the Department of Justice decided, you're making money. We didn't think you could ever make money when we gave you this approval letter to write books. So stop. And I said, no, I can't do that. So I was able to retire, and I just called my agent, Robin Rue, who's a fantastic agent with Writer's House, and just said, hey, if you can just get me a contract that'll be the same as I was making as a chief deputy, then I'm good to go. And because all my books before that, I couldn't sign a contract because of, what LEAP pay is, law enforcement availability pay, made it so that we had to be on call all the time. So I couldn't contract myself. So the publishers loved it because I was writing every book on spec. Like, okay, I'm spending a year of my time. Here it is. What do you
That's
think?
crazy.
Yeah, well, here's
I
some
didn't
money.
know that.
So I did 3 books that way. But I've been fortunate to have 2 careers. I had a person come up to me not very long ago and say, you just must be so lucky to have the dream job, the best job in the world, being a New York Times bestselling author. And I said, no, I already had that. I mean, this is a great job, but the best job in the world for me was being a deputy.
Yeah, it's interesting. 35 years ago, when I started the bookstore, actually 36 years ago on Friday, as it happens, is when we started the store.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we're having a party, and we have the Chismars who are going to be here to talk to us about spooky things at a lighthouse. It'll be very
Don
cool.
was 10 and I was probably 40.
And I was 50, so there you are. Anyway, there were loads of police procedurals. You had Joseph Wamba, you had a whole, and it was guys that had cool jobs, or at least jobs that, where they had stories to tell. And they wrote a lot of books, partly because, and there were some reporters too, I thought, they were writing them because things didn't always turn out in real life as well as they could make them work out in a novel. Well, now, that's kind of died away some, but now we have guys like you, writing military thriller. I mean, Mike Woodward, Navy guy, David McCloskey in the CIA, Don, we've already heard his credentials. What's your name over there? Marc. Sorry, my flight got in at 1:30 today from Paris. So on a different time zone. Marc, with a cool job. So do you find in part that you like writing the Arliss Cutter because those are stories that you lived yourself, or you can make them come out better than or
That's a
differently
great
anyway
question.
than
I
in
never
real
thought
life?
of it that
No,
way.
that is a really good question. And yes, that's they're not autobiographical at all. Although several of the fight scenes or something like that will be, I've been able to say, I wonder if this had turned out better that way. I mean, I have a 3-page fight that happens in Stone Cross. That when the guy came running out of the house, it was out in a remote village. And we saw this naked woman fly out of the house. Her fingers were bent at odd angles. And it was me and a trooper on a 4-wheeler going into town, little bits of snow on the ground. And she skidded across the ground. And we kind of pulled up. I was riding on the back of the 4-wheeler. And he stopped. We jumped out the 4-wheeler. And the guy that had been beating on her came running out of the house with nothing but a pair of briefs and combat boots that were unlaced. And he's running after. He doesn't even see us, right? He's running after her. I body checked him. He fell in the snow. And boots are kind of heavy. Those big, I don't even know what brand, but the kind that the government bids on, Bates, I think, something like that.
Yeah, Bates.
So they were kind of heavy. And so when he hit the ground with his top of his chest, and his boots came up and scorpioned him in the back of the head and just knocked him out. It was like, bam! And the fight was over in much shorter time than I just have to tell you about it. And I thought, well, that is really cool, but I'm going to add some cool stuff that Arliss can do in the middle. So I take things like that. I take things. My youngest son was an Anchorage police officer for about not quite 9 years. My oldest son, I said, was an OSI agent with Air Force. He's an ophthalmologist, retina surgeon now, but he takes after his mother, by the way. But for a very short time, we really overlapped. My youngest was in the academy. I was just retiring, and Ben was a OSI agent. I remember him calling me one time and go, "Dad, you know where I'm at?" I said, "Where are you at, buddy?" He goes, "I'm at a murder-suicide." And he starts to, and he had, he'd never worked patrol, so being an OSI, that was a big deal. And then I remember a short time later, after I was retired, my youngest son called me, and he was furious. And he was on field training, and I don't know if there's any law enforcement here, but field training is awful. It is a gut check to beat all gut checks. I mean, they might take you to McDonald's. Your field training officer might take you to McDonald's and make you fill out an application in front of everyone because you're never going to make it to be a police officer. I mean, they just gut check you all the time. And so he calls me because he's just been written up. And he said, "How come you never told me that intestines look like bubble gum? I was surprised. You could have made me ready." And I said, "Sorry, your mom wouldn't let me talk about it." So I just draw little bits for their war stories and put them in my book and fictionalize them and make them less. I have scars on my legs. My wife goes, "These are nice people. Stop telling that story."
So, Sniper, have you actually put anything in a book that related to your job as a sniper?
So I wanted to be a sniper. I was never a sniper. When you make the SWAT team, you go in front of the team leader and you tell them what job you think you want to do. And so I thought it would be really fun to be a sniper, mainly because I didn't know what snipers actually did. And so I went in and he said, "What do you think you want to do?" And I said, "On the team." And I was like, "Well, I was thinking sniper." And he looked at me for a long moment and he said, "I was thinking breacher." And I'm like, "Okay, I understand that."
You have the breacher look.
So not necessarily from the FBI, but what I did use from my actually military career, my second or third Clancy book is called 0 Hour, and it takes place in Korea, and it has a whole subplot with these Apaches. And so my first duty assignment in Korea was as an Apache pilot, and that was pre 9/11. It was like 99. And so at that time, that was the closest to combat you could get from the standpoint of North and South Korea. And to this day, they're still under an armistice. And back then, North Korea every now and then would shoot up a whole bunch of South Korean boats, or they would shell one of their islands. And so you would have this thing constantly where you'd be on alert, and then you would practice your go-to-war plans. And so I really wanted to pull that into a book, and it was a ton of fun being able to do it. And then the second thing I could do was take all the pilots that I flew with and try and put all of them in the book. And so I have one buddy that I could only put his call sign in, but he signs that book and gives it to relatives. And he's like, this is me. I'm in this book. And so it's super fun. I think what has been more, when my first book, Without Sanction, came out, I was doing a radio interview. And the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake?" My protagonist, Matt Drake. And I said, "No, I'm absolutely not. But I've stood in the same room with men who could be." And that has been the bigger thing, is that because of my job, when I got out of the FBI, I worked for a number of companies that were defense contractors. And so I'd go get to visit customers and listen to their stories and buy them a beer and be like, can I use that? And so there's an entire sequence in my first Clancy book, Target Acquired, that came from a Green Beret friend of mine. That actually, it happened in real life in Iraq, and I took it and moved it to Syria. But then you'll hear stories too from these guys where you're like, that's so good, but nobody would believe it. And so one I'll tell you real quick, I was talking to this Green Beret captain, and he had been enlisted, was a Green Beret, went to West Point, was commissioned in the infantry. He met his wife at West Point. She was an aviator. They deployed together, or they went into the military, and as often happens, the marriage didn't last. And so fast forward, he's a Green Beret as a second time, this time as an officer. He's in Iraq. His A-team comes under fire. He calls for gunship support, and the person flying the Apache shooting rockets over his head is his ex-wife. And I'm like, that is so good, but nobody would ever believe it. So don't you feel like you get that?
Oh yeah, and I remember sitting at morning coffee one time with a bunch of we in law enforcement call it intelligence meetings, but it's a way for us to start work kind of slow in the morning and be like the sheriff and several sheriffs and other local law enforcement and feds and whatnot. And I remember sitting by a U.S. probation officer, and then my partner and a couple of other people, and I heard my partner starting to tell, this was in North Idaho, and I heard him start to tell a story. And I listened to this war story, what had happened. It involved a train and whatnot. And my friend, the probation officer, who was my lifting partner at the time, he looked over and he goes, "Isn't that your story?" I said, "Yeah, but it's okay. Let him have it."
He's telling it pretty well.
Yeah, he's telling it. I think it's better when it happened to him than when it happened to me. So really what we're doing is I can't remember which and this is ironic that I'm saying it like this, but there is a very well-published writer, female, who said our job is to remember everything we heard and forget where we heard it. Remember who said that?
That's good.
Yeah, and that so we can take the credit, and that's what we do.
So you never know when you pair up a couple of authors, if the books, you know that the guys will get along, but what you don't know, because you haven't read the books yet, and I do read all the books for all the authors that come here, is whether the books are going to pair up, because sometimes you can have a great evening with wildly different books. I didn't know until I read both Deadline and Denied Access that we were talking origin stories tonight for characters. Yeah, it's really, so we have Arliss Cutter, we have some serious origin story stuff, and for Don, that was actually going to be my question. Why did you choose, out of all the things you could have written about, why did you choose to complete a trilogy that Vince started and then never finished?
Yeah, because I'm a fan first, and so everybody that's a Mitch Rapp fan, the reason, so I think we all loved it when Vince went back and told Mitch's origin story. And in fact, that is the American Assassin is the only work of Mitch's so far that's been adapted for TV or movies or anything. So there's even the movie for it, but there's this huge piece that's missing in that in Mitch's life, there are basically three women who were very, very important to him. So it was his high school girlfriend that became his college girlfriend, Mary or Maureen, who was killed in the Pan Am bombing. And there was later his wife, Anna, who was also killed in a bombing. His wives don't fare very well when it comes to bombing. And then there's a girl, Greta, who you meet in American Assassin. And by the end of Kill Shot, Mitch is Twitter-pated. Like, he's like, this is the love of my life. I will have children with this woman. I love her. And then you never hear from her again for the entire rest of the story. And so I thought, what happened to her? What happened between that and Mitch Rapp, and then when we meet him for the first time in Transfer of Power, we never hear from Greta again. The other thing I wanted to do selfishly is because Kyle did such a good job, but part of writing in this series is is you have to eventually kill some characters or they move on. And so there are characters like Thomas Stanfield, who was the director of the CIA, who died of cancer. You had Stan Hurley, who also died in the series. And so I knew if I got to do this, I would get to bring those characters back. And then the awesome thing about Vince's books is he leaves all these dangling threads and stuff in there. He was under no compulsion to actually wrap up all the plot lines. He would just leave them there. And so when I would read his books on the Kindle, I would highlight them and say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder whatever happened to that person, or I wonder what they're doing now. Or in the case of Thomas Stanfield, he talked about how Thomas was a member of the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, during World War II. And so Vince talked a little bit about what he did, but you never got to see it. And I thought, man, wouldn't that be fun to show what Thomas Stanfield was doing in World War II? And so that's how the book actually opens up. And then another thing, everybody loves Stan Hurley, and everybody's like, what was he doing during the Cold War? And so again, Vince kind of alludes to it, but you never actually get to see that. So in this book, you actually get a flashback scene too of Stan Hurley on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall causing trouble. And so to answer your question, I wanted to finish that prequel because I was a fan and wanted to know what happened to these characters.
Wow. Also, with no spoilers, it gives a great speech by Mitch at the end about who he's going to be, who he is and who he's going to be, which I thought was terrific.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm a great admirer of your work, as you know. That's why you're here all the time. So, Marc, Arliss Cutter, of course, I love the Alaska thing, having spent so much time there. But why did you decide to bring so much? Because this is really a family drama to a great degree.
Yeah. So in this particular book, it teases the origin story. There's a couple of flashbacks that talk about when he was younger. And Arliss, for anybody that hasn't read the books, he's a deputy U.S. Marshal who promotes to move to Alaska to help his widowed sister-in-law after his brother is killed. It just so happens that he's been in love with her since they were 16. And so there's this, I'm here to help you with the kids, but geez, I love you. And she's like, it's a lot of unrequited for a long time. And then I tease at it in this book. And this book, by the way, happens when it's 68, 69 below zero. The coldest I've ever been that I can verify, pretty sure it was colder, but the coldest I've ever been that I can verify was 58 below when we were on a tracking training in Fairbanks, and we drove north of Fairbanks to the White Mountains where much of this is set. And I remember thinking, man, it's getting colder as we go out, and you can feel the car kind of shrinking around you. And we stayed in a little cabin, a little BLM cabin, like I talk about in the book. And this was, pre-sat phones and all of that. So we were worried about our cars freezing up at night. And so we had these 2-gallon jugs, a drinking jug and a peeing jug. And we would drink lemonade or iced tea until we couldn't drink anymore, and then start our cars remotely and then go to sleep. And then being, 40-year-old men, we would wake up about 40 minutes later having to go to the bathroom, start our car again, drink a bunch more, and then go to sleep. It's just so cold that aviation fuel, gels, plastic, if you were to take this outside, it would just shatter. Probably the book would shatter. It's just a crazy.
That's
so
crazy.
I wanted the weather to be a character. I always want Alaska to be a character in the book. These are all rural books. Some in Anchorage, some in Fairbanks, but mostly rural. And so I really like that. Arliss against the bad guy, Arliss against his unrequited love for his sister-in-law, which sounds creepy, but it's understandable. She's sweet. And Arliss against nature and all that stuff. The next book, which is already done, and with the editor, half of it. So he was raised by his grandfather. Everybody called him Grumpy. He and his brother were raised by their grandfather. Their mother abandoned him when he was 5 years old. The next book is Grumpy in 1977.
That's
I was
awesome.
always fascinated by Stephen Hunter, going back a generation, and so the next book, half of it is Grumpy, half of it is modern day, and an overarching boy criminal that's old. That
I'm so glad you gave me that lead in because Stephen Hunter has gone all the way back to Arizona Territory in 1885 with Jackson Swagger.
oh, how fun!
And he's
on the
signing
list
books
then.
for us as we speak, and shipping them with any luck. He's not always reliable. Sorry, Stephen, but we'll hope that works out. And then I'm going to talk to him on October 7th. But he was inspired to write it on one of his visits here, and so yeah,
It's
so
really cool.
it is cool. But you're right. He has gone back and back and back with the Swagger family. From what was the original one? Earl, wasn't it?
Yeah, Earl. Yeah.
And then Bob Lee, then
yeah,
Bob Lee.
and Earl, and yeah, and I think you really get to know a character. Like why did so one of the things that Don and I have talked about is our relationship with editors. They'll argue with about everything. The title of the book. That really, I never get to pick the title. I think out of 30 books, I've gotten to pick 5 of the titles total. One Clancy, and really my wife picked that book or title, and they were scared of her, then scared of me. But we kind of go back and forth about a lot of things, and one of the things that I pushed back on with Arliss Cutters was Arliss's name. He's a big guy, he's tough, and they thought he should have a tougher name. His late brother's name is Ethan, and we argued back and forth about that. Well, why would anybody name their kid Arliss? You guys know where the name Arliss comes from? I grew up in Central Texas in Fred Gibson country, so that's Savage Sam and Old Yeller and all those. And little Arliss he's Travis's little brother in Old Yeller, and there's even a book called Little Arliss. And I always thought that would be a cool name for a tough guy because it doesn't sound tough, right? So when you know what his parents are like, when you know what his grandfather is like, you really get to know the characters. And I think Stephen Hunter does a crackerjack job of that.
The 47 Samurai is my all-time favorite Stephen Hunter book, in which we get Earl back, in the war. He's at Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal or somewhere in the Pacific. And then we get Bob Lee, cleaning it up later. It's my favorite Stephen Hunter moment because it's all about guns, okay? Stephen Hunter. Actually, we got a permit from the city of Scottsdale when Stephen came out here one time, and we were allowed to set up a gun range in the parking lot. And he brought weapons, and everybody who wanted to got to go outside. And, I tried to work that out with Jack on Sunday, but they said they weren't doing gun permits anymore, so too bad. I know. But anyway, it was a happy thought. But because of that, so the 47 Samurai suggests Japan, right? And in fact, there is a sword that comes up in the early part of it. So the question for you, the reader, is how is Bob Lee Swagger, super marksman, all the rest of it, going to deal with a samurai wielding a sword? So I wrote to Stephen on page 132 as I was reading along, and I said, I've got it. He wrote back, said, damn. But it's brilliant. Have you read it? It's absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Add that to the list.
He's just such a wonderful author. But anyway, we digress as we once again do. What is it you think you're going to do with Mitch now that you have completed, which, by the way, I did think was an absolutely great idea to wind up the trilogy. And so much of what you have to say about the world at that time is true again. In fact, there's a couple of speeches in there that probably can get you canceled.
Now you have to read the book
right,
to see
no, I mean, really, it's just, cyclical. I mean, life is cyclical. So what is it you're going to do going forward now?
Well, I am 42 or 43,000 words into the next Mitch Rapp book, and since it's your audience and I don't normally tell you what the book is going to be about, what I can tell you is Mitch will be in this book.
That's what I had to deal with as a Jack Ryan
tonight.
writer.
It'll be Mitch. Love it. But, you have an opportunity, really, if you're moving forward, to create new characters. I mean, you've had a great time, bringing back characters. I mean, there's a great scene with Stansfield in this book. But, there's nothing that says you can't bring in new people when you're doing one of these legacy things. You just can't distort, kill off, or otherwise change the people that were already created,
Yeah.
right?
Mostly.
Mostly.
Every
Yeah.
now and then I think it was Flashpoint. So when Mark and I were talking about like his approach to Clancy and then mine, because that universe was so broad and there's so many characters, I thought, well, what I'm going to try and do is take Jack Ryan Jr. through this arc. And so when I was thinking about him and that he was in the position he was in mainly because his last name was Ryan, right? His father had earned it, was a stellar CIA officer, all of that, but he was only there because he was his dad's kid. And I thought that must weigh on him. He must want to be able to prove, because he wasn't a special operations guy, he wasn't a cop, he wasn't anything. He just all of a sudden was an assassin at the campus, or not an assassin. He worked at the campus and then moved in. And so as part of that arc, he went from proving that he belonged there to leading a team to one of the most awful and formulative things as a leader in a law enforcement, in a combat, in a paramilitary, is when you lose a team member and how you deal with that the first time it happens. And so I wanted him to experience that, and so I had a character that I was going to kill off in that book, and we had a character. He agreed. I was like, I'm going to kill somebody. And he's like, what are you? And I was like, pick the person, Mark. They're going to die. And so I got permission to do it. I went all the way through to what's called first pass pages, which means everything was done. It was just the PDF version. And then the estate came back and said, no, you can't kill this person. And so I had to rewrite a quarter of the book and then figure out how to still do that. But so you can kill them sometimes, but they're also you got to be. Did you kill off anybody major? I can't remember.
Oh, I wouldn't do that. In the book I was writing at the time, the person he was going to kill off was the father of a baby of somebody else, and I was like, I got to rewrite this so that, and she was going to lose the baby, but I was going to rewrite it so that his posterity would carry on if he killed him. But then, so I rewrote a quarter of a book as well.
There were many points in our relationship that I was glad that Mark lived in Alaska, because I'm like, otherwise he's going to drive over to my house and strangle me.
Well, how about questions from the audience, guys? And if you want to hand me my little stack there, I will give away a book. Thank you. And then there's a couple more. So if you ask a question, you get a book. Yes, sir, in the blue. You had your hand up first.
Well, I have a question, but first I just want to share. I've read all the Rapp books like so many times, and I've never realized until reading Denied Access. I feel like as Mitch has progressed, he's always been reckless.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like as the books progressed, he was more methodical in his recklessness. I thought he did a great job of like removing that methodicalness because we went back in time and he was just like reckless again. So I'm just really impressed that you did that.
I appreciate you saying that. That was one of the things you had to think about, because there are really three different Mitches, right? There's the Mitch that's in the prequels. There's the Mitch you see when we meet him in Transfer of Power, where he's 32 or 33 years old, been doing it for a decade, very accomplished. And then there's the Mitch that Kyle wrote, where Kyle didn't age him, but he had enough things happen to him that it not drastically, but it changed Mitch from who he was, which is what you should have, right? You should have a character that grows. And so what I had to do is, to your point, is go back and remember that when Denied Access takes place, Mitch is only early 20s, 23, 24. He's only been doing this job for a couple years. He's fantastic at the job, but you can't, and Marc could talk to this, and what makes the old guys so good in law enforcement is not because they can still wrestle bears, which I think Marc probably could. It's because they did that job for 30 years, and they can figure out how to get the bear to kick himself in his head with his own boots so you don't have to take him down, right? The young guy's going to wrestle the bear. The old guy's going to stand back and do it. And so that was part of what I wanted to do with this one in Mitch, is show that he's still this capable guy, but there really is no substitute for experience.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is, you mentioned like there were 3 women in
Yeah.
I feel like there's a fourth.
Yeah.
That we need, like a Donatello Ron.
Yeah.
I feel like there's space to maybe fill in some of that, you know, because he obviously did a lot of work with her, and obviously she came into the story after they'd already had their life.
Yep.
He was involved with Anna and that kind of stuff, so it'd be kind of cool to see what maybe his experience was like working with her in the Mossad.
Yeah, that's another great one because Vince, and I'm reading that book right now, and I can't for the life of me remember which one it is, but Vince hints it a lot, and he hints at their backstory, and when Mitch and Donnie meet in Milan because he's over there with Anna and he's going to propose to her. There's this ton of history that's alluded to that's never taught, and that's pretty typical for Vince. I thought where you're going to gig me is the next important woman is Claudia, right? That Kyle had paired him with as well. But again, it's not good to be a woman who loves Mitch Rapp, right?
It's really dangerous. The book that I gave you, the David McCluskey book, tell him why.
Yeah, so McCluskey wrote The Persian, which is fantastic, and McCluskey is the kind of writer that writers love to hate because he's such a fantastic writer and he's such a good guy. And we're friends, but I also hate him because he's so fantastic and he's going to be the next Vince Flynn. And so I traveled to the other side of the world, to Barcelona, and I walk into a random bookstore just trying to enjoy myself. And what do? I come face to face with McCluskey's book. And so I do the mature thing and take my book and put it in front of his book. And then I take a picture of it and send it to him. I'm like, ha. And so as I walk in here 2 or 3 times ago when I was here, right, because it was before last time, Barbara's like, here's a great book that just came out, and handed me McCluskey's book again. And so I can't get away from him. But
That's true, but he does thank David in the acknowledgement to
I
this
do that
book. You
too.
forgot
I'm sorry.
about that part,
I
right?
can't say good things about him.
No.
So part of what because this is a Cold War book, and I think it's the only Vince almost exclusively dealt with Islamic terrorism, and so I thought it would be fun to write an old school kind of espionage thriller that it's a Russian threat, but is that Cold War stuff. And so I called up David McCluskey, who was a CIA officer, and said, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. And he said, there's this great book that's called The Main Enemy that was written by a guy named Milt Bearden, who was a CIA officer. And so I read it. I'm like, this is fantastic. And David said, well, he lives in Austin, where I live. And he said, would you like to meet him? And I'm like, yes. And so Milt's in his 80s now, and he said, just come to the office. And so you walk into his office, and it can be like Indiana Jones's office, but it's all espionage stuff. And so like on one wall is a picture of him briefing President Reagan. And then on the other wall is a picture of his arm around the last KGB director, and they're standing in Moscow. And then another wall is him standing on the Freedom Bridge in Afghanistan as the Russians are pulling out, because he had been there with the Mujahideen running covert operations against the Soviets. And so I got to talk to him for an hour and a half and just listen to his stories and figure out what I could use. And unfortunately, I also owe that to David McCluskey.
Anyway, that's why you have that particular book. Okay, next question. You pick.
Yes, sir.
Not a question, but a comment for Marc. I've had 50 below at Eielson, so I feel your pain. You know what it means. You have something to be proud of, or to take heart in, when you're comparing the Marshal Service with the FBI. You've got Tommy Lee Jones. That's true, and Raylan Givens, right?
Is that a question? No. Okay, then you don't get a book.
she
She's
could be
a hard
marshal.
woman. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have kind of 2 questions for both of you guys, and it's more about the writing experience. And I'm curious, as like when an author passes away, for example, Tom Clancy, and the series needs to continue, or the estate, you call it. How is it decided who takes that on, especially when you guys are writing together, or at the same time, because you're coming up with books every 6 months or so.
Yeah. So how do they pick the authors?
Yeah, like how's that decided? And my second question has to do with the characters. You guys have touched on that, but when you guys are bringing back old characters or wanting to kill off old characters, especially ones from legacy books, what's the process of like making sure that that character stays consistent with relation to their familial relations or their, you know, whatever, so that there's a consistency, so you're not messing that up.
No, those are great questions, and I think, and Don can speak to this as well. But we read all the with the Clancys. I read them over and over. So I had no idea it was coming. I was working on a Jericho. I'd finished a Jericho. Marc Graney I think it was New Orleans, in Bouchercon, New Orleans, and Marc Graney approached me in the hallway, and we'd gone to dinner many times, and I knew him well. I wouldn't say we were buddies, like friends, like we are now, but I knew him, and he came up to me and he goes, "What are you working on?" And I didn't know he was stepping away from the Clancys. And I told him, I said, I just finished this Jericho Quinn called Field of Fire, and he said, well, why don't you send me the manuscript? I'll give you a cover quote. And, you know, cover quotes that's the coin of the realm. And I hate asking other writers for cover quotes. I know how busy they are. I got 7 books on my nightstand or on my Kindle right now that I'm supposed to do cover quotes for. And it's just a big deal time-wise. And so for him to offer, that's the big deal. And unbeknownst to me, he took the manuscript and read it and gave me a nice quote and gave it to Tom Colgan. And so I was in Florida doing research for a Clancy, or for a cutter, my first Arliss cutter, and Robin Rue called me and said, in fact, if you go to my Facebook page, there's a pinned photo of me finding out the news, and I look like I'm dying. My wife, for whatever, I don't know what was going through her head, but she's like, Marc's having a heart attack. I think I'll record this with a photo. And so I'm like, and it was Robin saying, Marc Graney's recommended you for this gig. And I said, I can't do that. I've got this, I got that, I got this contract, got that contract. And she listened like a really good agent. And she's kind of got one of those transatlantic accents like Thurston Howell, you know. And she goes, Marc, this is Clancy, don't f around. and I said, okay, yes, I'll do it. So my wife and I, we go to this little island in the South Pacific to write generally. We have friends there. Sounds really snooty, but they give us a really good deal on a bungalow. Call it the mate's rate. We go to Rarotonga. We spend a couple of months every year, and I write. And so we took stacks of Clancy books. We took the Marc Graney books. We took every Clancy book. We took the Tom Clancy Companion, and I read one. She read one. I read a Graney, then I wrote. And back, I don't know how, I was the first one since Graney, and so Tom Colgan made me write 8 chapters and send them to him. Write 8 chapters and send them to him. It was killing me.
That sounds awful.
That's not the way I write. And so I was beating myself up trying to get all these characters correct. And I remember really just dying inside. And my wife was swimming in the little pool, and there was like 11 bungalows in the Pacific Ocean and a reef. And I went over and I sat down in the pool. It was just us, about 11 o'clock at night, and the wind blowing through the palm trees. And I just vented my spleen about how sucky my life was, and I was just Clancy. And my wife swam up to me, and she put her hands on my knees, and she's, let me get this straight. You're a New York Times best-selling author on an island in the middle of the South Pacific with your half-naked wife writing the next Tom Clancy, and you're sad? And I said, you're right, I'll go study more character stuff.
I think. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a lot of it's just personal referral. Just like
I think it is.
It's your mouth
He
of
already
it.
knew you, right?
Yeah, he knew me from my books and then asked me to do it.
Kyle.
Yeah.
In fact, the handover was here.
But is it approved by like the estate or something
Yeah.
like that? Or who?
Tom Colgan works for the estate. I mean, he works for the publisher, but he is the liaison to the estate. When an author dies, if he has created a literary estate, he has authorized what can happen. Male, when I say he, it could be she, whatever it is. If he hasn't, it's up for grabs. Then his family can decide what they want to do. So I encourage, I hope you're listening, I try to encourage this lawyer in me, all the authors that come through here, to create a literary estate and have a literary executor who is not related to you,
That's
which is a
wise.
really important thing. So not every author gets a legacy afterward because they may have decided they never, didn't want anybody else to write their characters, or sometimes it's just happenstance how it works out. It can be income for the family. I mean, that was true. Vince died very young. His wife had children. So it. But I don't know that he'd created an estate or whether he just left it. But anyway, it's so Tom is kind of like the coordinator of the whole thing. And
The puppet
editor.
master.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of them now that he manages: the Parker estate, the Ludlam estate,
W.B.
the Griffin
W.B.
estate. And so if Jack Stewart, for example, was writing for the Griffin estate with Tom, and then when Mike Woodward moved up to Tom, I keep calling him Jack Ryan Sr., then Tom was able to recommend that Jack write Tom Clancy. I'll never get it right.
Yeah.
Jack Ryan Jr. And now the Griffin Estate book will be up for grabs.
That's the same thing that happened with the Anderson Wilson. They
Yeah.
wrote for the W. Griffin, and then they moved them over to the Jack Ryan books.
Right. And most authors don't stay in that legacy realm forever. You've heard them talk about. At some point, either run out of stories or you want to write your own books, or,
yeah, you kind of have to bet on your own team at a certain point, because the Clancy books, and I'm sure, I don't know business wise what the other one, how they pay you, but they pay well and they open doors. Clancy, and I'm sure Vince Flynn, that opens doors to people like your case officer, and I was going through the CIA museum one time with this guy that was helping me. His name's Gary Schrone. I don't know if anybody knows who Gary Schrone is, but he wrote a book called First In. He was the guy giving Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen back when the Russians were there. And then when 9/11 happened, a guy named Cofer Black, who was a bigwig with CIA, told the president, "Yeah, we can get some guys in there." And then they stopped Gary Schrone on the way out the door and said, "Hey, we know you're retiring. You're 57 years old, but get a bunch of guys and figure out how to get to Afghanistan." So they took a shopping cart around REI buying cold weather clothes. And anyway, read the book First In. So we're going with Jim Lawler and Gary Schrone, walking through CIA. Actually, when I went through that time, Gary had passed away already, and we're walking through the CIA museum, which I would never have been able to go to with Jericho Quinn or Arliss Cutter. But they're like open doors when you're writing a Tom Clancy. And I'm standing at one little display, and there's a big picture of Jim Lawler, the guy that I'm standing by. And turns out, oh my gosh, you're a hero, dude. Yeah, well, so you really get to meet some cool people because of those, and that's the more than the money,
Yeah.
I think.
So Don is donating a book called Hostile Intent. Would you mind passing it to the gentleman behind you? One more question. Boy over there.
Big fan of Don's work, but as a newcomer, Marc, to your work, you guys mentioned that this is an origin story, which excites me because I like to try to read things in order. Would you recommend for this series, would you recommend this as an okay kind of entry into this series, or should I start somewhere?
You know,
Book or
that's a really good question. And I try to make everyone so that my goal is that if somebody picks them up, because I had a lady come up to me in Ketchikan last year, and she pulled up my website and she goes, "Man, you're the most famous person no one's ever heard of." I sell well, I make good money writing, but man, we got nowhere to go but up, right? And so when people, like, if I went to Barcelona, I wouldn't have one of my books to put in front of Don's. It wouldn't be there. But we do okay. So when somebody picks up this book, my hope is that they'll then go back to the first one and start over. Every book has a tiny bit of the origin story in it, a flashback to Arliss when he's younger, and then this one has a bit more, and again, the next one is even before he's actually the month that he's born. It's Grumpy's origin story, and Grumpy's dead in all these, but you should be able to pick up any of them and go, I wonder where that came from. I want to go read the rest. But every book has a beginning, middle, and end, a story that is contained within that book.
So if you're a Dunn fan, you've probably already read Forgotten War.
Forgotten War?
Okay, well, in that case, Don will give it to you at the end of the. Anybody else have a question?
I've read Denied Access. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
And you mentioned you like to use names of your friends, and the references in Denied Access were great. And my question is, has any of your friends put your name in their books? And if they have, would you be offended if they named a Navy SEAL?
Yeah, I would hate it. I would hate it if it was a Navy SEAL. Nick Petrie has done awful things to my name in his books. In this one, Simon Gervais, David McCluskey, both have roles. When I was writing my Tom Clancy books, I put my military friends in them, but I think it's really funny to change their branch affiliation. And so one of the main characters, Jad, in the Clancy book, that's a Green Beret. In real life, Jad is a SEAL, and I think that's hysterical, and he hates it because he works in the defense space, and he's like, I can't tell you, and Jad Monthauser is a very unique name, and he's like, I can't tell you how many meetings start, and I say, my name is Jad, and they're like, Jad, were you a Green Beret? And he's like, no, I was a Navy SEAL. But, yeah. Do you do that? You put friends' names in too?
I generally, some, but not other writers as much. I put a lot of friends in, but I just never have done that. I think so much of you guys that it would be kind of jarring to me. Now, you're in there. You just don't know which one is you.
I have a question for Marc. You've obviously got two great characters. Do you prefer writing one of the other or the other more?
No, it's by the time I'm done with the Arliss Cutter, now this will be the first Jericho that I've written since 2019, or I guess that came out in 2019, so since 2017, and so I'm so excited to get back to Jericho Quinn. But I will say that because I wrote 7 Clancy's in the middle, the Jericho Quinn that comes out next in spring of 2027 will be a much more, I hope, mature Jericho Quinn as far as the writing and all that, because I was learning as I went.
Aged him?
Not so much, no. We're going to start out right where I left off, but as far as the writing and the storyline, and like you were mentioning, Vince did a lot of Islamic terrorism. I'm kind of done with that. There's so many problems in the world that I want to explore other little problems, and I have friends in the intelligence community, and then like Don and I read a lot, and I'll take Jim Lawler and when Gary was alive, take Gary Schroen out and basically give him pizza and wine, and then just sit there with a notepad. And then I like Jim Jim's a writer as well. He's written some really crackerjack books about handling. I mean, they're fiction, but they're about basically handling assets and that sort of thing. So look up Jim Lawler. But I'll sit and listen to them, write down their stories, and then the next morning when they're clear-headed, I'll say, "Hey, can I use this?" And they'll go, "Oh, did I? Yeah, okay, you can use that, but don't use that." So I really enjoy that kind of stuff. And then by the time I'm done with one of those, I'm sure I'm going to be super happy to get back to an Arliss, because I miss the Marshal Service every day, and by writing about Arliss Cutter and my old, people that I worked with and that kind of thing, it's fun to write that.
Your comment about reading a book and then being able to get a sense of what might have come before,
Mm-hmm.
I will agree with you. That is what hooked me. I read the last 2 books ago and then went back and probably found all the rest of them.
Oh, thank you.
And great, enjoyable stories.
No, I appreciate that. The thing is about those books is 20 years or 22 years in the Marshal Service, I was doing research the whole time. I just didn't know it. And so being out in something like that fight in this particular village that happens in Stone Cross, or going down to Southeast Alaska. Next year, I'm going to be on a Holland America cruise in Southeast Alaska, talking about the next book. It's called Backtrack, because it's about back in the future, or back to the future, back in the past, and Grumpy and his life in Texas, and then much of it, the last half happens on a cruise ship. Holland America and Expedia found out about it, so they're going to have me on this cruise in August, just talking
That's
about
awesome.
the book and showing them Alaska and showing them where I used to work, and that's really fun for me. It doesn't feel like a job.
Wow. Well, I think I can see, I don't know about the rest of you, but I can only sit in this chair for an hour. And we're now at an hour and 15 minutes. So thank you very much for your patience and good manners and for coming tonight. Let's give our authors a round of applause.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Virtual audience, thank you very much for joining us. And if you guys would fold up your chairs and move them over to that wall. Don't use this one because they slide down and take away. You can line up and get your book signed. Thanks very much for coming. Have a safe